Thank you, Bob. I'm glad you did say a lot of those things. I'm going to tell you about food. Ne hekafan meya, have you eaten yet? Has been very common. I've heard this as a child growing up. I still hear this now from those that are of the low Wakio spawn. Ne sikafana, ne hekafan meya, have you eaten yet? And it's very important because it comes from a culture that has known starvation. It comes from a culture that knows what it's like not to have enough to eat. I, unlike the speakers before me, I believe, am the only immigrant. I was a baby paper son immigrant, basically an illegal immigrant to Canada in 1950 after the Chinese were able to get citizenship rights in 1947. And the result of that was that my grandfather brought myself and an older brother, an adopted brother, also a paper son. And also different than the others, I didn't grow up in Vancouver. I grew up on the prairies. So my food stories are prairie food stories. Not only are my food stories prairie food stories, my food stories are those of a kid growing up in a cafe. My grandfather was a cook. He owned a cafe. That's all he ever did. When he came to Canada, he got into the fact that he wanted to be near the food because that's what you do when you've known starvation. So he started off shoveling coal, you know, into the burners that kept the place, and then he learned to be a food prep, and then he learned a bunch of menu and recipes. And in fact, my grandma used to say that my grandfather had hundreds of recipes in his head. He could make hagao, he could make siomai, he could make buns, he could make apple pie, he could make anything. And part of my food story is what he did when he was on the prairies, because my grandfather was famous in our small town in Battleford, Saskatchewan, for taking what was available. Wild duck, black bean wild duck, moose meat, black bean moose meat, venison, black bean venison. But actually the venison could be stir-fried. The venison could be stir-fried. And probably more important, it came from the local area, from the natives. You see, my grandfather ran a cafe in a small town that without the indigenous people, without the Métis, that business would not have survived because the genteel people of that town did not come to our cafe, except for those that really needed to, that were on Main Street, that came by. They would rather go somewhere else. We had the only cafe in town. So they would rather drive 3 miles across the river to another cafe. And surprisingly, as I recall, across the river in North Battleford, there were 5 Chinese cafes. But this will give you an idea. My grandfather, without the indigenous people, without the Métis, our family would have not survived in this country. It was only due to them that I'm standing here. So it is with gratitude that I tell this story about the indigenous and the Métis people who helped my grandfather perfect his black bean venison, black bean venison. But there was more than that, because you know, in the area there's also fish. And where I was, we had goldeye, you know, the very famous Winnipeg goldeye, pickerel, which is better known as walleye pike, and of course North